great to be with all of you again. Nice to see some returning names and faces who have been with us throughout the years. We've been doing these sessions, various different frequencies and so on since the start of the pandemic, actually, in early 2020. We now meet every Thursday at this time, 11 a.m. Eastern, 8 a.m. Pacific, for the Next Practice Weekly series. If you're new to I4CP, we are the Institute for Corporate Productivity. We're a human capital research firm. We discover the people practices that drive high performance in our research and our conversations that we have with HR leaders and other corporate visionaries and thought leaders. We look at how high performance companies are doing their HR and people practices differently than low performers. We use pretty standard metrics for what we mean by high performance, as you see here on the screen: revenue growth, market share, profitability, and customer satisfaction. But we like to tease out those next and best practices that organizations are doing differently at high-performing companies. We are a member-based organization. You see here just a small slice of logos representing some of the I4CP member companies. You see they span all different company sizes, different market industries, from finance to high-tech to manufacturing to retail. We've got very large companies here like Amazon, Microsoft, 3M, and others. We've also got a growing cohort of smaller organizations, those that are unicorn, sort of startup in nature. If you're with a member organization and attending with us today, a special welcome to you. If you're not with a member company, welcome to you as well. And feel free to reach out to anyone at I4CP to learn more about what membership entails. My name is Tom Stone. I'm a senior research analyst here at I4CP, and I have the good fortune of co-hosting most of these Thursday sessions each week. And this week, I'm joined by our CEO and co-founder, Mr. Kevin Oakes, as our co-host. Hello, Kevin.
Hey, Tom. Good to see you.
Good to be with you this morning, and we'll get to our very special guest in just a moment. But before that, a couple of other preliminary items. As I've said, this is Next Practices Weekly. So as the name implies, we meet every Thursday at this time. You see some of the upcoming guests that we'll have from companies like ServiceNow, Citi, and Pax8 in the upcoming weeks. A couple of other things. We recently released our annual report called Priorities and Predictions. This is something that we interview our executive level HR boards, of which we now have 7, and during the fall time frame, as everyone's thinking about the upcoming year, and we ask them what are their priorities for their HR functional area, what are their predictions for that area in the new year. We aggregate all of that together, pull together their priorities, predictions, and put out a report. This is, generally speaking, our most downloaded item of the year. It always garners great interest. This is available to the general public, so everyone on the call can just follow the links that Zeta is putting in the chat if you'd like to download this item. We'll also be going through in a public webinar soon, coming up on January 30th. 2 of my colleagues, Kevin Martin and Lori Likens, will walk through some of the highlights from this report. So if you're someone that prefers to digest things through a webinar, feel free to register for that event. Being registered for these Thursday calls doesn't automatically register you for this separate webinar event. So you will need to follow the link and register for that separately. And so with that, I'm going to turn things over to you, Kevin, and ask you to please introduce today's special guest.
Thanks, Tom, and I'm thrilled to be here with Oscar Munoz. Oscar's an executive I've followed for many years now, and certainly is somebody that probably doesn't need a whole lot of introduction. He's best known for being the chairman and CEO of United Airlines. So, Oscar, welcome to our Next Practice Weekly call.
Hey, nice to have me. Sorry, I've got a little bit of a long COVID cough going, so I'll apologize if I cough on that. But thank you for joining me, all of you. I quickly went through the chat, and I saw somebody that I've known for a long time. So, PC Bryant, welcome. And it's funny you say that most widely known for my role at United. I hope to, at the end of my whole long experience in life, be known for something broader than that, right? I mean, as we all strive to be impactful and leave a legacy of just being a good human being to others and helping others make decisions and charting courses of direction based upon who we are, not what we people expect us to be, and so on and so forth. And PC will know this from my railroad days. the old heads, as we call them. These are very, very senior 30, 40, 50-year veterans of the company. When they spoke in sort of glowing emotional terms about the legacy they left, and they prodded each other to do this, they always said simply, just leave the place better than you found it. And it's a really good sort of operating metric that I would provide to all of you.
Yeah, for sure. And I should have mentioned that Oscar is going to be one of our keynoters at our upcoming annual conference, Next Practices Now, and you can see the date and the location down at the bottom. So this conversation with Oscar is going to be a bit of a prelude to what we'll talk about in Scottsdale in just a couple months. But yeah, just building on the career, Oscar, you've had an incredibly long and successful career. You worked at Pepsi and Coca-Cola earlier in your career, and then later AT&T, CSX, and then concluding with United Airlines. And now you serve on numerous boards, too many to mention, but I'll mention a couple well-known ones. So Salesforce, you're on the board of that organization. You do a lot with Fidelity Investments today. I know the American Heart Association, we'll talk about that a little bit later, is important to you as well. I'd love to just hear a little bit more about your career journey as you've looked back on your career. What's that been like as a business leader, and what has it taught you?
Gosh, that's a very broad question.
Mm-hmm.
I think, so let's start with what it's taught me. I think that's probably the most important thing, this concept of leaving a place better and a legacy and all that sort of thing. We all, through our careers and lives, experience a ton of things. We try to provide that advice and guidance to our family, our children, often to very closed ears, right? Because when we're young and going through things, we often don't really care to hear from others because we're charting our own course and we're independent. And, I read this book and I've heard that this works well. I think, the journey and what it's taught me is the proverbial, if I knew then what I know now, how much easier, how much more effective, how much less angst and anxiety, potentially avoided a couple of failures along the way, because all of that will happen to us. And you wrestle with the balance of, you provide all that input and guidance and experience so people don't go through it, but then will they learn how to endure through difficult moments, which will happen inevitably. So I opt for what it's taught me is a few different things that I try to espouse or suggest in very simple terms, so that people, when they're walking around doing whatever it is they're doing as leaders, they'll remember a simple concept. Books can be very difficult to read and understand all of them, so I tend to modify my comments to very simple statements, and I'm sure I'll sprinkle in a couple over the course of the day. But the career, for all of us, it starts, from our early days. At least for me, it is the decisions that I make, the way I lead, the way I make difficult discussions. And as I've learned about my past and history, I have realized that some of the values that are instilled in me have been latent or dormant from way back when I was a child. I have a grandmother, maternal grandmother, who I spent the first 8 years of my life. I was born to a single mom. My single mom left. I was in Mexico, and she left for the United States to make a life for herself and then eventually for me. But I spent these 8 years with this incredible woman who didn't really have a job, didn't really have a home, but homeless we were not. If you know Latino, Mexican family, or any family in general, right? You're never quite without a home. There's always families and friends, and we call them tios and tias, uncles and aunts, that are everywhere. And we traveled on buses, on trains, and walked through literally the dusty road, holding her sort of grizzled hand, because the job that she did is when we went to someone's house, she always had to pay her way. So she worked as a homemaker, housekeeper and such. And we went through, I don't even remember how many places we went to, but all throughout that course, never once a complaint, never once a loud word or harsh word for someone, never blamed anyone for anything. She had lost her husband. Her husband was 43-year-old loved asbestos lung cancer. So she was left alone without much. And I didn't realize how much I'd learned until I got later on in life. And I learned to lean upon who she was and what she taught me that made my career. And so from that point on, the career takes many shapes and sizes. You know, you go to school, you get a job, you have work dynamics, you learn how to get along with people, you learn how to hate some people. You realize that, like everyone in the world, there's envy and petty and selfishness and greed. And I want more money than that person. And why are they sitting? So you go through all of those things that we all go through. And you reflect back on how I was able to get past that, because in my most emotional negative moments, where some of those negative idiosyncrasies that we all have in us would rise up inside me, I would simply think about my grandmother. Or when she was alive, I would call her, and she was a very simple woman, didn't speak English, but she would just simply, she'd have this look like, dude, really? This is what you're worried about? And it's really taught me how to connect and bridge gaps between people. And everyone that's known me, that's worked for me, I mean, I'm sure they'll say many different things, but I always try to bring two sides together, regardless of where I sit on this, because again, charting a North Star is a concept that only works if everyone, or most of everyone, is behind you. So, excuse me.
And, you know, it's clear you've been really a pioneer your whole life, Oscar. You grew up with a large family, right? You had many siblings, and, you know, out of your siblings, you were a pioneer in many respects.
Yeah. Well, I'm often introduced as the oldest of 9 children. And I always laugh when I get up to the podium or to the stage. And I say, well, technically, because I'm the oldest, they'll say the oldest of 9 children. I say, well, yeah, technically, because I had this heart condition, this medical device, this medical issue that I had to deal with. So my heart is new. I have a replacement heart, which is now 35, 36 years old. So I do the hashtag youngest child sort of play, where I'm not technically the oldest anymore, since I'm actually maybe the youngest. So that doesn't sit well with some of my siblings, but it's an amusing way for that. But, you know, the oldest does chart the course to some degree. And for me, it didn't happen by itself. You know, often your own chart is coursed by many people around you. And there's a great Tennyson saying in the poem Ulysses, where he says, I am parts of all that I've met. And if I had an epitaph, I think I would use that one, because all along the way, from early on through all of my career, someone somewhere intervened or injected themselves into a conversation to sort of provide me guidance and input that has been very meaningful over the course of time. And again, back to the concept of what you've learned of your career, that concept of that sharing those things is caring about a person. Mm-hmm. And so I try to do that with people that work for me in our feedback sessions, for sure. But people I see around and in my new life on these boards and all these philanthropies and all these folks I meet in organizations like this, you just try to provide that little bit of sharing that often it's awkward to sometimes tell someone or suggest to someone that something could be done differently or better or with a broader audience, et cetera, et cetera.
Well, you were the first of your family to go to college, and then you went to grad school as well, and then that led you to the career that you've had, which you've had a lot of firsts. You were the first Latino CEO of a major U.S. airline, and really one of just a few Latino CEOs in the Fortune 500, which then culminated in the book that we've put up here on the screen. Turnaround Time, Uniting an Airline and Its Employees in the Friendly Skies. So let's talk about the book a little bit, Oscar, and I'm sure the book is really, you know, your life story. But what led you to write it initially?
Well, first, you know, this concept of the first is many of you on this call have first to go to college. I mean, we all have that designation. And I know there's a lot of folks from the HR space and DEI has become a politicized bomb. And the book has a degree of an immigrant story, rags to riches, racism, all of that is built into a structure, but it's never the issue. I'm never sitting there, oh my God, woe is me, here's what I went to. And because the rising emotion in me over the years has been that, how do I really affect my heritage and the people coming up behind? How do I help everyone without the usual concepts that we all do, which are valuable? But for me, this first is a one that I've changed around to. I'll say it very dramatically. I am sick and tired of being this exception. Oh, he's the only one who does this, the only guy. And how do I build a community and a process and an engagement and a following of sorts where I become the expectation of this younger generation? Similar to the African-American community, you know, when President Obama became President Obama, that means a lot to people in neighborhoods that just, and so that's the mission. And so the book had this, I talk about this all the time, and people would say, you know, you should write about that. I'm like, oh, shoot me now. I have no interest in sitting down and writing a book, but with the help of a wonderful friend and confidant who was my longtime communications director, we hobbled it together. And the intent is to weave a narrative and a story of what I feel is a very common story in America. Whether you're an immigrant or not, whether you came from a small town in the middle of the country where, you know, college wasn't a thing, whether industrial, urban, or farming community, and how the concept of, while certainly a level of intelligence that was given to me by someone above, how do you maximize that? And the many lucky things that happened to me that I put myself in the middle of that led me to all these wonderful opportunities. An example would be walking around in high school, you know, between classes, you know, ditching from one thing to another. One of my high school counselors, Mrs. Duckworth, and I turn around, there she's there. She goes, "Are you Oscar Munoz?" So I'm like, maybe. And she goes, "Oh, you know, you're on my list. I noticed that these this preliminary SAT test scores came back, and I was wondering where you're thinking of going to college." And I again, this is an honest. I said, I don't know. It's like, what's a college? I didn't know what that was, and therein lies the rub with regards to what diversity and inclusion in particular means. So many people have no idea that that's an option. I grew up in a very blue collar. My dad was a meat cutter. My mom was everybody around us was that way. So, you know, you graduated from high school, got a job, got married, had kids, and lived happily ever after. And many of my, you know, family does that today. But every once in a while, there's someone that has the opportunity and maybe a little bit of the ability to do something different, but for that person intervening. And so when we have this emotional political debate about inclusion, I told that story. I said, you know what? You don't have to do jack shit other than look around you and give a hoot about someone. Find someone that has potentially a lot of capability, but zero resources or guidance or direction. And that's what true inclusion means to me. And so the book is kind of an excerpt of that from the DEI thing, how to bridge gaps between very difficult situations. And importantly, the fact that crisis and bad things are going to happen, and we all feel horrible and awful, and how you bounce back. I mean, you know, maybe we'll probably talk about one of my more infamous instances about a passenger being dragged and beaten off one of our aircraft. And it was awful. My response initially was awful, but as I like to say, it's never, ever too late to do the right thing. Boeing's going through that. I work with Boeing. I know them well. I'm a CNBC contributor. So they asked me, I mean, I was on TV 3 times last time. They all want to get me to say, shouldn't the person be fired or this? It's like, you know, it's like, no, that's not what this process is about. It's about building an environment and a culture that allows you to respond in a positive way and fix things. And so the book has all of those things in there, and embedded in it is a little, if not a lot, of guidance to people, like a lot of people on the call, where they can see, importantly, themselves, right? I mean, the person that has a Harvard MBA and 18 of his relatives were Harvard MBAs doesn't have the same experience that other people do. And I think more of America has more the experience that I share. And so embedded in that process and the conversations that have followed and in the book, I think people have found it very useful. And to some degree, heartfelt, yes, but heartwarming, of course, because Brian helps me tell a wonderful story. But more importantly, it gives me wings, to use a aviation term, that I too can make something work. And again, made the 1,000 speeches on this. The book is selling well, and people write and ask all these questions, and almost all of them start with, "I see so much of myself in you and my journey." And then there's always questions around that. So that's where the book came out. And COVID probably helped, because COVID just brought everybody down, and that's when we got to write a few of the chapters.
Well, there's so many ways I could take the questions here, Oscar, but let's stick to the book.
Sorry, I always throw them off. Sorry.
As I told you when we talked earlier, I've been a longtime United customer. I'm a 2 million miler, going on 3 million miles. I've even got a little plaque that you signed, for congratulating me for achieving that status. But I'd like to go back in time a little bit about what United was like. It was post-continental merger. So when you joined the organization, it was in a real tough time for the organization. And I'd love for you to describe what it was like when you joined.
Yeah, I think there's some visuals that we have found over the years of that time and how people wrote and spoke about United and its issues. There was one very dramatic picture of a United aircraft sort of tied in knots in the air, if you will. That was that probably is a good picture of what my phrase after a few days on the job. I did a Wall Street Journal article, and of course they're probing, hey, what are you going to do? How are you going to do this? All those sorts of things. And it's like, what have you found? And I'm a fairly open and transparent person, and this whole concept of saying the right things at the right time is important in media for a lot of different reasons. But sometimes, like I said, you have to be yourself. And I just immediately said, what have I found? I found 3 dreadful Ds: disengaged, disenfranchised, and disillusioned. That's what I'm seeing in the very humans that work their asses off to take care of your flight experience, every one of those 2 million miles. And that, for me as a leader, was the immediate sense that there is zero I can do here, bringing in more this and buying this and doing this and more training and all that stuff. No, it's like when you've lost the very humans that, for 100,000 people, so in 80 different countries. So this isn't a factory floor. This is a broad-based organization. And there is no supervisory work. I mean, there's no, if the 3 of us, are on the ramp and unloading and loading bags, there's not a supervisor watching. It's like, hey, don't do this or that. It is self-directed. And what that means to me is, I call it discretionary effort. I can say, you know what? I'm going to come in, I'm going to do what you tell me, and that's all I'm going to do. And I'm going to see a ton of things that I could easily do to help the next person, to help a customer, to help the business. But if you don't give a hoot about me, and if you make me feel that way, you know what? And that adage is everywhere, right? Treat your employees well, no, treat your customers well. Right. You hear that stuff all the time. The big learning is, who do you really listen to that? And so the organization was in a shambles. We had operationally very poor, tangled up. Financially, we were slowly bleeding financially. Other people were really taking our mistakes and using them against us. I talked a little bit about the employee base, and then of course our analysts, the community was that, and then of course customers are part of that. So there was not a constituency of a large corporation that was like, you go United, unless it was our competitors maybe, because it's like, no, yeah, go ahead, keep doing that. So it was a mess.
And a lot of that was the merger that had happened with Continental, we've written a lot about this, where there's a lot of due diligence paid to the business merits of an acquisition or a merger up front. Very little attention paid to how well the cultures will mesh together. And that's usually what derails acquisitions long term, is that you have a cultural mismatch and they never get integrated together. And I think when you joined, that was certainly a complaint. I certainly felt it as a customer about the combination. You could almost immediately feel when you went on an airplane, even though it said United on the side, okay, this is a Continental, this is a Continental team, this is a Continental plane. And I think that, for the first 5 years or so, that was a big part of the problem. And I think you'd agree with that.
Yeah, so I was on the board at the time. I was one of the prime architect and driver of making the merger work, not necessarily taking into account your good points with regards to how the culture's going to mesh. It was a bit of survival. I always draw an analog or akin to musical chairs. There's a bunch of airlines, and there are going to be less airlines, and you're either going to be part of a bigger one and drive that, or you're going to be looking around saying there's no seat. And you're seeing that with JetBlue and the failed Spirit thing. I think Alaska and Hawaiian are going to face some issues.
Right.
And so you do these things for a reason. This concept of merger of equals, and there'll be people on the call that as soon as I said that are rolling their eyes, because if you ever hear that term announced, literally run away, sell your stock, because there is no such thing. Because you just mentioned it, right? They're two different cultures, and more importantly, proud cultures. When United and Continental merged, Continental was on a high. I was on that board. We were doing so well all across all the angles, and United was already in its so. But historically, I mean, United was the friendly skies. They were the man. I mean, that was the, and so the people, the culture inside of United always had that memory. Even the 85 Bears in Chicago, right? Chicago still talks about the 85 Bears, even though it was quite a long time ago. But the pride still exists. And part of the process that wasn't being followed by previous leadership, for lack of a better term, you weren't acknowledging that people did things for a reason. It was a merger of equals, but most of the top level jobs came from Continental. So Continental started imposing their views and principles and systems and practices on people without regard to, hey, you realize that United is 3 times as big as Continental, and what worked between 3 hubs is not going to work between 5 with an international exposure such as this, whether it's systems or process or even leadership, people that don't see the bigger picture. So what wasn't being done, and what I preach all the time, is this concept of listening, learning before you lead. And it sounds, oh yeah, sure, we'll do that. It's like, nobody does it because you're in such a hurry, right? Hey, you made this merger, you promised $1 billion of cost takeout, and let's go take the cost out. Let's show everyone. And so you have all those pressures. But again, it's never too late to do the right thing. And we talked about how I found United when I got there. I followed that same advice for myself. And when asked in public on an earnings call, with analysts who are looking at, when they ask you what you're going to do next, cut people, I'm going to shut stuff down, I'm going to step on someone's throat. They want to hear that sort of active oriented thing. And I answered with the quintessential bad answer as far as they're concerned. I said, you know what? I don't know yet. Like silence. It's like, I mean, you don't know yet. CEO, what's that mean? It's like, no, it's like, I am going to spend some time and really listen to the people that run this business every day, that touch the customer every day, to see what they have to say about this, because embedded somewhere in that mechanism, there's an answer to all of this. And the merger was one where, gosh, by the time the merger was 5 years old, we hadn't signed contracts with unions, which is what you saw on your flights. And I won't go into all the gory detail of what the handcuffs we had about how we could operate a very sophisticated logistical enterprise, but not being able to use. I mean, the 3 of us could be pilots, but if we are one side or the other, and there's an aircraft there waiting for a pilot to take you as a customer somewhere, neither one of us can get in because we were, United or Continental, and you had all of these restrictions that were awful. And so we hadn't solved the union issues. And a lot of this was just that was the big impact that we had, the big thing we had to face when we first started with the journey.
I love your emphasis on listening, though. We've done a lot of work on culture change, and one very common tactic that successful companies have used to change their culture is the CEO resisted that initial knee-jerk, I'm going to have action and make immediate decisions, and instead went out, listened to the employees, listened to the customers to make, a very reasoned plan on how they were going to change the culture going forward. And I've said this to many senior executive teams. The worst thing you can do is lock yourselves in a room as a senior executive team and decide amongst yourselves what the culture is today and what's wrong with it and what needs to change. You really got to get out and talk to the employees. And that's what you did. You spent a great deal of time doing that.
There's a note that just came up from Cecilia that speaks to a little bit of that issue with regards to, you could gather the executive team and you could talk about culture and stuff. The issue is not everybody's wired for this thing. And this concept of listening in particular, and I've seen it done very badly. I've seen people that have listened to me, listened to my book, saw the experience and success we had at United and try to emulate the same thing. But it's kind of like in public speaking, people tell you should open with a joke to kind of get your nerves out and quiet things, unless you're a really bad joke teller, because then it's just more awkward. So this listening thing is different for different people. I have a natural ability to connect with folks for a lot of different reasons. The workforce at United is very many ethnicities. I have good working knowledge of several languages. I come from being poor to some degree in union workers, so I have that connectivity. And I genuinely, honestly appreciate the value of someone that sits down and wants to tell you something, however they tell you, however inarticulate or emotional. I've had people yelling at me, big people yelling at me. But inherent in that is, again, back to the sharing is caring. You need to get them to share again, because at United, we had 8 CEOs in the previous decade. So if you're a frontline person, you're like, you know what? You go away. I don't want to talk about this. And so that's why listening and learning and leading it has to be deeper than that. Your leader, whoever he or she is, and what is their best way of doing it. I do it my way. And some people are more introverts, or they prefer to do it in different ways. But however you do it, it has to be, oh my God, it has to be genuine. Nothing other human can see is disingenuous, right? It's like when somebody's like, well, we're gonna do this, or we're gonna listen to you, we're gonna do this, and nothing happens, or people come in and they feel like, it's like, however you do it, it has to be a deeply felt emotional projection that the people, or the aura of people are saying, like, you know what? Because what happens in an organization, everybody leaves that room or that floor or whatever it is, then they go back to their job. And then the 20 people that didn't go to this event because they could care less are going to ask, so Kevin, how was it? And whatever you say is going to be the voice for it. Like, it was a piece of crap. This guy came in, blah, 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 same old crap, right? Like, okay, so 20 people just got that, like, they don't care. But you come back and you say, that was different. The guy, or the woman said this. And so however, as a leader, you're able to do that in your own abilities, in your own simple way. Again, if you're not a joke teller, don't tell a joke.
Right.
But the genuine nature is what I would really emphasize. And so the listen and learn is you listen, you take back, and then you go back and listen again and say, okay, folks, here's kind of what I heard. Does that make sense? No, yes. All embedded in that process is people are what? They're opening up. They're feeling part of this. And no matter what you end up doing, whether it's exactly the thing you tell them or they told you or not, they feel part of it. And that's the other, by the way, from a lot of my CEO friends, like, but the problem is, if I go out and listen, they're all going to expect me to do all the things they're telling me. And they don't understand the business. They don't understand the intricacies and the complexities and all that stuff. And it's like, that's not correct. because your conversation, if it's genuine enough, you make them feel like they're listening. And then you say something very simply, thank you for that input.
Right.
Realize that I am gathering lots of information, and based upon everybody's feedback, I have to narrow and winnow it down to one or two simple things that we are going to start with. And if I had a leadership lesson on turnarounds, that would be the one. Find the one thing that you build the infrastructure for everything else to come around. And if you do that right, everything works. In our case, it was regaining the trust of our employees because they were gone. So.
And that's we titled this conversation "Creating a Culture of Empathy," and that's really an important word to you, I know, and a big part of what turnaround time is all about is how you try to tackle the culture in the organization and create a more empathetic culture, but also a more united culture overall.
And with the business overlay, a great story probably is of this empathy and bridging of differences and solving for problems at the same time was, we talked about the unions and no contracts have been signed. One particular union, our flight attendants, kind of critical to the customer experience, you might agree. Between United and Continental, they're far apart and themselves, and then trying to get one contract for United was 7 years in the making. 7 years. And so you can imagine the emotion that was associated with that. My previous administration did not like the unions and exhibited that, and so we were at an impasse. And so I come in with my style, and I want to listen and understand. The head of this union, a woman named Sarah Nelson, I would not talk to me. I have nothing to say for you. You're just gonna say the same stuff, and you're gonna promise something here, and you're gonna screw us over at the end of the day. The contract is still gonna be all those things. So finally, through the help of another union leader, our pilot union leader, who I had spent time with, he gets us together. And it's a good story in many ways because it's an example of a lot of these things that I'm talking about, and it's a proof point, not just promise that this stuff works. So Sarah walks into my office with the body language you'd imagine, right? Like, I want to be here, I want to see you, I want to talk to you. And so, like, well, what do you want to talk about? And I didn't do this on purpose. It wasn't going straight. Again, it's back to kind of how I lead, and because of this empathetic nature. It's like before getting to the business, I said, "Hey, Sarah, it's because maybe just as an introduction, can you give me a sense of how you got started in this union leadership business?" Mm-hmm. And I'll make it short, but in essence, she was a young flight attendant with not a lot of steady jobs. They don't get paid much initially. And what happens that, there's all these young people running around the country because we need them for this flight, and then we got to get them back. But what do they do in the interim? Where do they live? They don't have any money yet. And so she was in one of those situations where she was in some city. She had zero money in her bank account, sitting in an airport. She doesn't know if she's going to get a job, a flight today or tomorrow or the next day. So what do you do? Where do you sleep? And, after that happens for a while, you have a lot of those stories early on. And so she was emotional and crying, and somebody tapped her on the shoulder and asked her what was going on. And this woman pulled out her purse, wrote her a check for $500 and gave it to her, said, "Here, use this." And, this woman was another flight attendant who was one of the union leaders. And therein is the story of how this Sarah Nelson person rose to the ranks of being president. And that story is what carries the day. So supporting her constituency, having felt those things, those are all human values. As an adversary of sorts in this public world of words, she was very powerful because she could tell that story with huge emotion and passion. And I didn't want to use it against her. I just wanted to know what happened in that conversation as she told me the story. We both got a little emotional. Yeah. And what happened from that session is we walked out together, we shook hands and said, I promised her, I said, I know where you're coming from now. And that is very important to me. I understand your path and your passion, and we're going to make this work. And I promise you, we're going to get this thing done. And we did. And to punctuate all of this, if you look on the back of my book, the first endorsement is from Sarah Nelson, and her term is Oscar saved United Airlines. And so that's kind of a whole story. That sounds a little self-endorsement sort of thing. I don't mean it to be that way, but That's how these things work with real life people and real life situations, because that was a really tenuous, intense situation that just by a mere listening act, it created a bond of trust. And we solved we solved that thing pretty quickly thereafter. We still fought for a while. It didn't go away completely.
It's a union after all. You had so many iconic, and I would say emotional, tense moments in your tenure as CEO and then chairman, and probably the one that you got the most publicity over, or probably was the most tenuous, was the Dr. David Dow incident that you referenced earlier. Tell us a little bit about that. As you look back on that, how would you have done things differently?
Oh, okay. So let's start with the subject to a degree, because it's a great example to all of us, because we will all have that Dr. Dow moment. We call it Flight 3411 in United lore. And so there's a business experience, business knowledge, learning, all embedded. And I'll try to do it very concisely. The facts behind the situation worked against me, because what happened, United Airlines or a United Airlines employee had nothing to do with. Was the first thing, right? It was the Chicago.
Wasn't your airline, right? Yeah.
It wasn't our airline, but it was we sublet to them, so our name was on that. The actual altercation was with the police, which are taught to, if somebody pushes back, they're taught to use force, and they did, very obviously visually. And so we knew that, and then we also knew that the individual himself wasn't a particularly upstanding human being. So the instinct was, wait, it wasn't us. This guy's not a great guy. Is not telling the truth about many things, and who kind of keeps going back and forth to fighting with police, because the obvious is going to happen. All correct, but absolutely wrong in the court of public opinion, because the first response from me was internal legal and regulatory team trying to adjust words. There was a word about overbooking, which, oh my God, we can't have that word out in the sphere. So we changed it to reaccommodate. Like, what part of a human being getting the holy crap beat out of him and reaccommodate? What part doesn't fit? So that was like, that was huge aspect. In hindsight, would I have used it? No, of course. In hindsight, we're the first global viral video to impact a company's brand and reputation. Literally. Yeah. And it was in 2017, so it's like, wow, that's not true, Oscar. Go look. We've looked hard. We haven't found anything. China had 800 million views because Dr. Dow claimed to be Chinese. He's Vietnamese. And so China was, it's like, we want to hate Americans. Anyway, and so that word reaccommodated just really took people by storm. And would I have used that? But why did we use it? It changed a lot from, wrong, but it changed the overbooking word and took it out of the regulatory space. And we didn't know what Twitter was. I mean, we knew what it was. We didn't realize what in Weibo in China, we no idea. Nobody really quite knew. It was kind of a fun thing that people used, and but it wasn't. But it got viral really quickly. So hindsight, we should have known what social media was about. And now every giant corporation has a whole social media team that works those things. So that's the first thing. And then the second thing that I did is kind of stand up for my employees. I just told you how I feel about them, how I connected them, I know them, and they had nothing to do with this. And so that sat very badly on top of, you're using the term reaccommodation to beat somebody, and then now you're saying your people are fine, kind of thing. So awful first day. But again, as I say, it's never too late to do the right thing. And we decided that going on TV was going to be the right thing, and chose the biggest audience and the biggest forum, Good Morning America. And the afternoon before, I was being prepped on how to effectively tell the story I just told you, so that the world says, no, understand, United we're good people. This wasn't really us, and all of that. And as we sort of went through that process, it didn't feel good to me. But it's a lot of pressure, and it's just everyone's calling for your head. It's very intense. That whole concept of lonely at the top and all that, That was
Right.
one of those moments for sure.
Sure.
So the story for me, and this is where everything really comes together with these latent dormant values, my grandmother come into play, because middle of the night, I got up and I couldn't sleep, of course. And when I get back to the bed, I kneeled down and looked up, not because I'm a pious person, but it was one of those moments where, the brand of the company, me as a Latino leader, and oh yeah, see, he can't do this. All that we were on a roll. United was in a short year. Our operational metrics, our finances, our stress. They went from what's wrong with United to, hey, an exciting what's next, what new development we were going to have. So it was a really good point. So all of that pressure and stress was really building on top of us. And as I looked up, I remembered my maternal grandmother, who I introduced to all of you early on, never complained, never blamed anyone, worked hard, and all sorts of things. And I didn't know what I was going to say the next morning, but I knew it wasn't going to be like, hey, look at those people. And so I remember it vividly. I didn't know what I was going to say, but when asked about all of this stuff, I said, yeah, it was horrific. And what they go through their question. I said, yeah, I said, let the policies and procedures of running an airline get in the way of doing what's right for another human being. And that will never happen again in our company. And then we put rules out there. And of course, the funny part is the gasp on both her ear, because the producers are waiting for another, CEO to go
Right.
this and this and spin. And my team, regulatory, legal, corp comm, are like, oh, you're not supposed to say that, right? Because it invites legal issues and all that sorts of things. You're admitting, actually. But again, it's, what was the right thing? There was nothing to do at this point. Like, we screwed up the initial response. At this point in time, it's like, you're right. We have policies and procedures that don't often work for things. We're going to make sure we adjust and change some of those things. And then we're going to do these 10 things. And so inevitably, it went from the worst response PR business case at all the business schools. And they've all now shifted to how to recover from screwing it up really bad. And it's kind of fun to go back and talk to those folks about that. But again, embedded in that, latent dormant values about who you are as a human being, that I was taught to not blame someone, it's turned out right or wrong. Because this didn't go well, by the way, especially with our employees, because they're like, what the hell, Oscar? Why are you not telling everyone the truth? It wasn't us, right? They wanted to, and I spent a lot of time, I called it my contrition tour. I went to China, I went to everywhere, in all our facilities, to explain myself in that way. And again, nothing is right or wrong in these cases, because the issue was already out there. But it's guidance for all of you in some way, in a slightly dramatic fashion. By the way, it's not dramatized. It's exactly as it happened. But you're going to face those moments, and you're going to face a decision where there's no one around to tell you what to do. And you're going to have to determine what that is and live with it. And for me, at the end of the day, in the back of my head, I said, I'm going to be talking about this for the rest of my life. So I don't want to have to remember some spin cycle sort of thing that I was taught to do. I want to just do it, let the emotion flow, and this is what happened, and it worked out for us. But the proverbial truth, it's a really wonderful thing sometimes. And you just own it.
Well, it was from the heart what you had to say, and that leads me to I want to talk about the heart issue that you had alluded to before, Oscar, because I know this is a big part of what you're out talking about these days. You're doing a lot of work with the American Heart Association. So for those who don't know, tell us just a little bit about the issues that you faced.
So I had a heart attack, a massive coronary event. There's a concept called the widowmaker. There is no real such medical term, but it's an extreme. One of my doctors said, you took the concept of a widowmaker and gave it the middle finger. That's how bad my event was. The PSA, if you will, that you're about to hear is I had no known experiences or issues with my heart. I had no known aspects of that. I had just raced on a 100-mile bike race and finished in the top 10%. I was a vegan. I was a vegan because one of my sisters had cancer, and I was supporting her with her diet. I figured I had more weight than hair to lose because everybody else was shaving their head. I always drop that one in because I think it's funny, but nevertheless. And so I had no history of this whatsoever. But I did have a friend, a cardiologist who I trained with for my marathons and races. And he had always, as a cardiologist, he'd always kind of give us advice like, hey guys, eat better, exercise more. And he'd always say, you'd be surprised at how relatively young and relatively fit people that die on my operating table are. And the reason why they die is because the symptoms of heart attack are many and varied. They're different from men, different from women. There is no like, oh my God, it's the big one sort of thing. They're very different. And people don't recognize them and then in fact don't do anything about it. So, we'll go out somewhere and feel something, you'll sit down or lay down or take a shower. And the dramatic part is you're not going to get up. And that's why it's the biggest killer in America by far. 56% of deaths. I mean, it's like cancer and all its illness and ugliness has nothing on heart disease because these symptoms are weird. So what he taught me and what I tell you all is he said, anytime you feel anything, and he used the term weird, and we all know what our body is just call 911. The worst you can be is embarrassed. Yep. And then he added a very dramatic, and when you call 911, he goes, immediately tell them where you are. You're like, duh, right? So, because no, and he added, because you may not make it past the phone call.
Right.
And I remember looking at it, was like, okay, Mark, my name's Mark. Like, that's a little dramatic. But fast forward to my event, I'm 37 days into the job at United. I'm doing all of this crazy. I am everywhere. I am working, traveling and seeing people 20 hours a day. And that's not an exaggeration. And when I'm not, I'm trying to make an impact on people. It's like, hey, this guy's different. He cares. He's listening. He's replying. He's responsive. And so I'm working hard, but I've always worked hard, and like everyone else. That morning I went for a run, and it was just a 5-mile run for me, which was nothing really, in my training. Came back to my apartment, and it's still a rental apartment, 48th floor of a building, middle of Chicago. And my phone buzzed across the way. And I went to go get it. And as I stepped, I felt weird. My legs were a little rubbery, and I hadn't run that far. So it wasn't that. So I said, I remember thinking, oh, that's weird. Took 2 more steps, and my legs actually gave out. And I was kind of clammy. Mark's words came rushing back. I crawled to this thing called a landline. You guys might have heard about that. I've just read about them. Called 911, immediately told them where I was. And then I don't know how much longer. I remember I had enough foresight to think I am in a 2-bedroom apartment with 1 door and it's locked. So I somehow crawled to the front door and opened it. And I just remember the door opening and and this is not true, 2 Latino EMTs coming in to help me. And from that, 37 minutes later, I was on life support and a medically induced coma, which I was in for 7 days. And then my heart, as my doctor said, has received major insults and required a transplantation. There was nothing they were going to do to fix it. I tried to wear this device that, kept it working. Because, the concept when somebody says, yeah, we're going to need to replace your heart. You're like, yeah, it's a big no for me, dog. So I fought to that until enough doctors said, you've got to do this. And then the miracles continued. The Byzantine process of applying for an organ and is very, very, very clean. So no one can buy their way on and all those sorts of things. So endured that concept of, think about what are you waiting for? You're waiting for someone to perish so you can take their organ. So if you're a religious person, what are you praying for? It's like, help me, or so it was mentally it was a weird thing. But at the end of the day, on the morning of my birthday, the call came in for my heart. Yeah, I don't know. And it's funny how that happens for a lot of different people. So I had a heart transplant. 7 days later, I was out of the hospital. I left on a Thursday. I was back in the office on Monday. And again, the medical aspect of that is amazing. I have a lot of restrictions over time that I sort of pay attention to, but you now see me here, alive and personal. So all of you remember that.
Well, you're a competitive guy. I also read that you almost beat the record for recovery from a heart transplant.
The 21-year-old kid, though, that's like age group wise, I win.
You won your age group. Oscar, I could talk to you all day, and I'm sure that our audience could listen to you all day. But we're running out of time here, as Tom brought up the screens again. I just want to thank you for everything you shared. Is there any one piece of advice you want to leave? Our crowd obviously is a lot of HR folks, HR executives on the line. Anything you want to impart before we meet again in a couple months in Scottsdale?
Yeah, so many things. I think probably, especially for the HR folks, this concept of proof, not promise. I think often as support functions, we have good ideas and good intent, and we roll them out with great fanfare to the folks that run the business every day. Operations people have a lot to do already, and HR-oriented stuff sometimes isn't top of their list, we might say. So how do you affect and capture their hearts and minds with the way you present, the way you assist, the way you support? Sending an email to do something is not being done and completed. It's just, I mean, I see that a lot. I'm not picking on HR in particular, but a lot of support functions. So this concept of proof, not promise. Saying you go to head of an operation, hey, here's what we'd like to do. Here's why we want to do it. Here are the results. And here's how I am going to do all of this. And all I need for you, leader, to do is these one or two things. But that, prove to them that the passion and focus that you have for that, whatever topic that is a meaningful one. And DEI is probably one of those topics where it's like, I don't have time for this stuff. So how do you prove to them that the promise of having a broader audience with broader thoughts is meaningful to the daily decision making that a senior ops folks have to make?
Yeah. Well, DE&I is, I know, something you and I talked about earlier. We could talk about that for another hour, I'm sure, but we'll save that for our conversation in Arizona. I just, as we're running out of time, I want to thank you, Oscar, for joining us. This has been tremendous. Appreciate everything you've done for the industry and just sharing your story, which we can all learn from. So thank you very much for joining us today.
Thank you. And please look me up on LinkedIn and Instagram. I share a lot of this stuff. I've really made an effort to get a lot of this stuff out. So I would love to be able to share that stuff further with all of you. So thanks for having me. And I'll see you in March.
You will. Tom, I'll turn it over to you to close us out.
Yeah, I'll just also extend my thanks and gratitude to you, Oscar. Lots of great sharing. You're getting a lot of very personal thank yous in the chat. Maybe I'll copy those out and send them to you a little bit later, more than just the standard thank yous. A couple of quick things for everyone else on the call. If you have a certification from HRCI or SHRM, and these calls on Thursdays are available for recertification credit hours. Zeta put these same program and activity IDs in the chat, so jot those down if that is relevant to you. We also earlier put the link to Oscar's book in the chat as well, so I encourage you to pick that up at Amazon or wherever you'd like. And then one last final reminder, as you see here, front and center in the middle, second row is Oscar. He's one of the great speakers that we'll have at the Next Practices Now conference, March 25th through the 28th in Scottsdale, Arizona. If you haven't registered for that yet, I'd encourage you to do so at i4cp.com/conference. And with that, I want to thank everyone for joining us today. It was a riveting conversation. Thanks again to Oscar. Thank you, Kevin, for facilitating, and we'll see everyone again next week.